In the words of Edward Murrow, to be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. To be credible, we must be truthful. In today's lecture, we are talking about persuasive speaking. This is chapter 15. And I like to begin this lecture with that particular quote. And I don't know if any of you know my undergraduate degree is in broadcast journalism and mass communication. And he was really one of the founding fathers, if you will, of the discipline, born in the early 1900s, and was really a force to be reckoned with in the field of radio broadcasting and then later on television. He was known for stopping the McCarthyism, Senator John McCarthy, who was targeting individuals in the United States, calling them communist. So he was really one of the first journalists to really attack Senator McCarthy and to serve as a true watchdog on how the government was officiating. So I just like to begin there because one of the things with persuasive speaking, especially in today's day and age, you really want to think about your credibility as a speaker. And you need to speak about something that you believe in, but it also needs to be tempered with reason and logic, your character, and emotions as well. So what I'll be focusing on in this lecture is really understanding persuasion. We're going to talk about what persuasion is, break it down for you, and how to make a persuasive appeal. So persuasion, it's the process of influencing others. So this is your final speech. You're going to be making an argument. You're going to be making appeals to your audience. The goal of persuasion is to get your audience to do, to think, or believe something, to motivate them to try something new, to motivate them to change. So your goal is to influence your audience. Some of the building blocks of the persuasive process, there's two main building blocks in this process. Number one is you have to create appeals. And number two, you have to construct arguments. So with regards to appeals, it's when you're making a request to an individual or to a group of people with the intent to influence that individual or that group of people. And you're calling on others to do the same. You want to get them to adhere to whatever claim it is, whatever appeal it is that you're making. So for example, let's say if you're in a face-to-face class and you want to appeal to your professor, you have a doctor's appointment, but you know the attendance policy is X, but you've already missed one class and that's all you were allowed. So you're making an appeal perhaps to your professor to say, look, this was a legitimate situation because I had to go to the doctor and it was really an important matter. So you're making an appeal, you're not really making an argument, but you're appealing to your audience, and that would be your professor, to get them, to influence them to change their mind about perhaps how they'll mark your attendance. Now, an argument is more about using reason and logic. It's also an attempt to influence other people, but you're really constructing a claim that's based on your logic and evidence to support that claim or to further support that argument. And within this class, you're going to be doing both for your final speech. You have to construct a solid argument, but you also need to make appeals within that argument. So appeals and arguments, all arguments equal appeals because you have to have appeals within your arguments, but all appeals do not equal arguments. So keep that in mind. You might appeal to your professor based on their generosity, but that doesn't mean that you're making an argument. But an argument will always have an appeal. And if it doesn't have an appeal, it's going to be very difficult for you to influence and persuade your audience. So moving on to some of the ethics of persuasion. So if you turn on the television, you might just think that ethics has completely gone out the window, that there are no ethics anymore. And although that might be the case for many individuals in this class, if you can take something away from persuasion, it's to understand that your ethics, your personal character, how you enable your strategies of persuasion says so much about who you are as a human being. Number one, be honest. Be honest. Don't try to shade the truth in any particular way. Just be honest. If you're making an argument and there are some statistics that don't fully support your argument, address those statistics. You can give your audience a little bit of leeway to say, yes, I do understand that some statistics do not support my point, however, and then you would explain that. So be really honest with people. Honesty goes such a long way. People forget just the simple act of honesty. And audience empowerment. So speaking to influence ethically equals persuasion. You want to empower your audience, and persuasion is speaking in an ethical manner. Coercion is when people speak by threat, force, or some type of deliberate deception. Many chapters ago, when we talked about governments and politics, oftentimes if you have a leader that is more of an authoritative type of leader, let's say you're talking about communist China, oftentimes free speech is threatened. If you look at instances now like in Hong Kong, free speech people are fighting for, but it's threatened now because the Chinese government and many of the Chinese individuals within China do not value free speech because that is how they have been socialized. That is how they've been conditioned. So when they do speak, oftentimes it is by threat or force or some type of deliberate deception. And that's not empowering your audience. And that is a form of coercion. And that is not what we stand for as citizens of the United States. So moving on, we touched a little bit in chapter 3 on the psychology of persuasion, but you want to get a little bit deeper into psychology. You have to understand, when we talked about audience disposition, that you must use reasoning, but you also have to have feelings. So you have to have logic, but you have to have emotions. Also, appeals are more likely, when you're making an appeal, to inspire feelings of others. So literally, we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but you want to be thinking about, what emotion do I want to invoke within my audience by telling this story or by making this appeal? So you really literally need to think about human emotions. And human emotion, if you can go from lower emotions to neutral emotions to higher emotions, if you want to take your audience from shame and sadness and guilt to bring them to joy and hope. So you truly want to think about, what appeals are you making, and specifically what type of emotion do you want to inspire in your audience? And arguments inspire thinking and reasoning. So we need both. We need the appeal and we need argument. Aristotle is the father of classical rhetoric, and it's important that you, as a speechwriter, understand Aristotle's rhetorical triangle. If you look at the evaluation form for your final speech, you will be evaluated on ethos, logos, and pathos. And that is a classical approach to argumentation. Now, rhetoric is one of the oldest arts and a science, if you will. We can also look at it as a science. But it's the study of the ways in which speaking and writing influence people. So it's the study of the ways in which speaking and writing influence people. And my mentor used to say, no, rhetoric is not rocket science, but it is older than rocket science. Rhetoric can be used for the good, and looking at history and even today, rhetoric can also be used for immoral ends as well. So again, going back to character, your character as a speaker and credibility is what Aristotle would say. Your ethos is the most important part of a persuasive speech. So we want to use rhetoric for moral ends, not immoral ends. Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So there are 3 means of persuasion. So when you're constructing your argument, you want to make sure that you incorporate logos, which is logic, that's your reasoning, inductive, deductive reasoning, and the evidence that you use to support your reasoning, such as statistics, graphs, expert testimony, research, that's to support your logic. Pathos will be your emotional appeal. So that's when you're saying, okay, I want my audience here to feel a sense of guilt and shame. And then there, I want them to feel a sense of responsibility and hope and courage. So literally, you're thinking about that as you write your speech. And then the third component is ethos. That is your character, your credibility as a speaker. Now, right here, there's a link, Ethos, Logos, and Pathos. There's a video, and you'll have to end the slideshow and actually play the video, but it really nicely explains how to incorporate ethos, logos, and pathos into your speech. So we talked about logos. You're appealing to reason, you're appealing to logic. Pathos, you're appealing to feelings and emotions. You use language to equivocate so that you're on the same page as your audience, so that you can connect with your audience. You do not want your speech to only be about emotions because it's highly ineffective on its own. But when you combine pathos with logos, you will be much more successful, or at least increase your chances of being successful at persuading your audience. So it's very ineffective if you just rely on emotional appeals. And you have to see the other side of pathos. It can be seen as manipulative. So you want to make sure that you're not going too far with your audience. There's something called cognitive dissonance, where you push your audience to the edge of the cliff. You want them to feel uncomfortable, to experience some dissonance, discomfort, and then you provide them with the solution, consonance, which is whatever your solution is, so that they can get back to homeostasis, so that they can get back to that consonance, that level of comfort. So you don't want to push your audience, though, off the edge of the cliff so that you're seen as a manipulative person and you're just trying to use this persuasive story so that you can manipulate people. So there's a fine line, and you have to walk that line when using persuasion and using emotions. You have to couple it with logic. And finally, ethos. You appeal to your audience. It appeals to your wisdom or your character as a speaker. You can build your audience, you can build your ethos by how you present yourself, how organized you are, the experience that you have, the sincerity that your audience believes. Do they believe you're sincere? Do they believe you're trustworthy? Do they believe that you're competent? Do they believe that you're credible? And you want to build that into your speech so that they do perceive you as someone who is worthy of delivering this speech and who is competent and credible to deliver this speech to them. And ethos, part of your ethos, it holds rational and emotional appeals together. So you need both. So you need the rational element, but you also need the emotional element as well to appeal to your audience. So the ways in which ethos comes into play, ask yourself the question is how your character, so how does my character emerge while giving a speech? So that's a question you should ask yourself. How does my character emerge while I give a speech? Also, what is my reputation with this audience? So you know who your audience is going to be for this class, but outside of this class, when you're asked to give a talk, what is the reputation that you have with your audience? And then finally, your ethos. Before your speech, how you even set up, your audience is evaluating. And then after your speech, what is your ethos? So before and after. So these are all questions that you want to ask yourself. Ways to maintain ethos and create ethos and maintain, and just your practical wisdom. The Greeks called it phronesis. Your moral virtues, do they see you as being a good person, a rete, and your goodwill toward the audience, that's eunoia, and do you demonstrate that goodwill toward the audience? So this is how you create it, and this is how you maintain it. Ethos as self-evidence, your demeanor as a speaker will communicate your ethos to the audience, and your reputation. So that's just self-evident. What your reputation is with this particular topic, with this particular audience, and what your demeanor is as a speaker. So that goes back to chapter 3 and your self-concept. Your self-concept will determine in part how you see yourself, and it will also determine in part how your audience sees you. So now we're talking about appealing to needs. And as a speechwriter, you want to think about what is going to motivate the individuals in your audience. What is in one's best interest? What is going to fulfill their inherent needs? And one way to understand what human needs are is to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So moving on to the next slide here, you can really use listeners' needs to better understand human beings. So if you look here, what this hierarchy is communicating is that as human beings, if our lower level needs are not met, then it's pretty difficult to meet our higher level needs. So when you're looking at this, you want to think about who is my audience and where are they existing in their life? And am I able to reach them? Number one, can I meet them where they're at? Number one. And then number two, can I take them to the next level? So I want to give you like a real life example, and I've used my grandmother before, and I'm going to use her again. She started off. She was born in the she was born in 1925, and she was a nurse, and she started off in psychiatric nursing, and then she worked in labor and delivery. She was a circulating nurse in the operating room, and later in life, she was a nursing director at a Catholic orphanage, and she was from New York, and she would literally go into the homes of children in the city, in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, and she would have to remove them from homes for various reasons. Some children were sexually abused, some were physically abused, emotionally abused, and then she would bring them back to the orphanage and help them to assimilate and to adapt. And as a nurse, she really understood Maslow's hierarchy of needs. She understood that their basic needs had to be met first before they could go up to self-esteem and achievement and mastery. So what she understood as a nurse and as the director was that the children that she brought to the orphanage had to be fed, they had to have the shelter, they had to feel safe and secure, because many of them still felt fear, and they had to, at some point in time, to connect, to feel a sense of belonging. And she knew all of that had to happen before they could achieve in school, before they could master specific skills. So she knew it. She, as a nursing director, allowed children to stay a little bit longer without going to school right away, because she knew that these basic needs had to be met first before that higher level need of self-esteem, achievement, mastery could be met. And oftentimes she would be in conflict with some of the higher ups who said, look, we've got to get these kids through high school, or we have to get these kids through middle school or elementary school, and they can't fall behind. And she said, if you put them into a classroom right now, right after they have just gotten here, you have just done what? You've set them up for failure, because we know that if these needs aren't met, it's almost impossible for those higher level needs of achievement and mastery to be met. So she understood on a very fundamental, the human psychology, what our basic human needs are as people, as individuals. And if you want to take someone to the next level, you must meet them where they're at and connect and adapt. And then you might be able to take them to the next level. So when you're thinking about your final speech topic, are you trying to appeal to a physiological need, a safety need, a love and belonging need, a self-esteem need, a self-actualization need? And then ask yourself the question, where is your audience at? Because none of us know what anyone goes through. And maybe your audience, some in your audience really don't have a freedom from fear. We don't know. So you really have to do your analysis to understand where people are at, what need are you addressing, and then how can you take them possibly to the next level. So this is really cool stuff. It's my favorite part of the semester. Now, when you're appealing to emotion to your audience, you have to think about, is this justified? The emotional appeal that I'm making? Am I going to inspire trust or loyalty on the basis of feelings? You want to make sure that you do, as a speaker, offer supporting reasoning. And you do have to understand that when you're appealing to emotion, that sometimes you're going to be regarded with distrust, because some people will say, nope, I just want the facts. And you have to know that. And then you have to inoculate against that possible distrust that you might have in your audience. Some of the distrusted emotional appeals that perhaps have been used on you before or that you've seen in a history class. Number one, fear appeals or scare tactics. If you turn on a commercial, oftentimes they are fear appeals or scare tactics. Think of just a very simple commercial about tooth whiteners. So the fear appeal is that you're not going to be likable if you don't have extremely white teeth. And that's just crazy talk. But nonetheless, that is an appeal and that can work with people. But you want to really be mindful if you're using a fear appeal that you're doing it in a way that isn't manipulative and that you're doing it in a way where the ends will justify the means. So really be mindful of the fear appeals that you use. Sometimes they can work, and when done ethically, they are okay to use, but you really need to keep in mind your ethics. Another example of a fear appeal, I was thinking there was an individual who was trying to sell me an ADT, to get ADT hooked up at my house. And then he was trying to upsell me to make sure that I would get the actual, this little buzzer that I could hit just in case someone came in through the garage. And he used this story about someone coming in through the garage and they didn't have this little clicker, and then they were attacked. So that's a fear-based appeal, and that can work with some people. Is it ethical? So you as a speaker, just keep your ethics in mind. Is it something that's necessary or is it not? Number two is propaganda. So if you've taken a history class here or elsewhere, you might have read some of the propaganda that was used in the United States or that was used by Nazi Germany to get people to feel a certain way. And propaganda is something that you want to stay away from. It's highly unethical, and you want to do your best not to use any form of propaganda as an emotional appeal. Just highly unethical. And false advertising or fraud too, again, highly unethical. You want to make sure that you do not make any claims that you know are absolutely false. So to recap, we covered under how to understand persuasion and the persuasive appeals. We covered ethos, logos, and pathos. And overall, you want to be thinking about the way in which you can best persuade your audience and but still keeping your ethics in mind as a speaker. And just remember, don't raise your voice, improve your argument.